Hello everyone, this will be part 3 of chapter 23 of Regular Boy Daniel Wayne, written by Diamond Rosie and read by Insect Overlord. October 28th, Monday, 6:03 a.m. 2. Danny was surprised when a knock came on his door. "Hey, dames," he greeted, opening it. "Did you have any breakfast?" Danny asked when he didn't say anything. "Not yet." He was dressed in his school uniform, and his bag was slung over one shoulder. He peeked around it at what he could see inside Danny's room. This one didn't have a bug from last time. "You were still sleeping, weren't you?" he asked with a disapproving brow. "No, I was awake. Should we have breakfast together?" Danny offered, heading down the stairs. "I suppose." After breakfast, Alfred took Damien to school, the only one that was going today. The others had taken the day off because of Danny, since he was supposed to go back to the hospital today in case anything like last time happened. He already knew that this would end up a long ordeal and was not looking forward to being stuck inside the hospital's sterile walls. He already knew they wouldn't find anything. They were looking for a core ache, and those weren't traceable using human methods. He hadn't had one in months now, so the sudden surge made him more vulnerable than when he had been prepared for it. Doctors were certain that it was a heart-related illness, though. All the cardiovascular specialists in Gotham pledged that they would be unable to rest until they were credited with finding the label for whatever plagued Bruce Wayne's lost son. By the time they pulled back into the Manor driveway, Bruce was fretting about all the rare and unique diseases Danny might have, while he could only sit in the passenger seat with unmatched fatigue. Dinner was mundane, and Danny didn't have the energy to maintain any of the conversation he'd been offered, and just left to go to his room after. Danny had commented many times now that his room was the size of this whole house growing up, and tonight it seemed to represent that house in more than just size. He tried to seclude himself in the corner of his lab. The lab was designed to give Danny an open view of his room, while keeping itself secluded from the rest of the room. The sentiment only seemed to work against him now. The already large and grand room only looked all the more expansive. The furniture was larger than Danny had ever seen anyone own growing up, but somehow there was still a massive amount of open space in the room, echoing his solitude. 3:24 p.m. Dick told Alfred he'd handle the pickup today, happy to watch the younger boy's green eyes light up at the familiar car rolling forward. Surprised to find Dick, and instead of asking about Alfred, "Where's Daniel?" he asked, taking the passenger seat. "Hi, Damien. It's great to see you. I missed you too. How was school?" Dick bit with a light snark as they drove into the main road. "School was mundane as ever," he said, more irritated than normal. "I don't understand why I was the only one that was required to go, when the others were allowed to stay home for Daniel," Damien ranted. "We didn't want Danny to be alone in case anything happened," Dick explained. "And Bruce thought it was still important for you to go so you didn't get used to skipping, and so no one would think things were too bad back home. You know people are always watching you." Dick knew that Damien would handle being given responsibility over a task better than being sent because he was the youngest. It wasn't that they didn't trust Damien to stay with Danny, but his reactions on Friday and Saturday said a lot about his emotional state. Of course, it was a good thing that Damien had an age-appropriate reaction to what was objectively a horrifying situation, but he would not take that information for what it was, and any developments he'd made to accept his behavior would probably be abandoned. Especially if he knew it was the reason he wasn't allowed to watch Danny. He would take it as a slight on himself and make sure it didn't happen again. Dick had tried to teach Damien that he came before Robin ever would, and he had barely managed to make a dent in the thought process he'd already established about his identities. Danny hadn't had much better luck, but the no stakes he provided Damien must have been refreshing, and Damien grew quickly and surprisingly attached to Danny in the short time he'd been there. Despite all his growth, Damien still was not comfortable approaching emotions he felt were not appropriate for Robin to have, like the fear at the sight of Danny's accident, or the helplessness at the hospital. Telling Damien that him going to school was to preserve the family image would quell his distaste. He'd already convinced himself that he would need to be the next heir to the Wayne Foundation, and as the heir, he would need to maintain his image in the eyes of the public, or something. "Richard, do you suspect Mother of scheming?" The question seemed random, but Dick could tell Damien had put a lot of thought into it. "We would know if the LOA was in motion, Damien," Dick said comfortingly, placing a hand on his leg as he drove. "You're worried about how Talia will act about Danny, huh?" Damien didn't answer as a form of agreeing. "We'll keep him safe," was all he said as they pulled up to the Manor. Dick knew Talia would never knowingly hurt Danny, but he didn't know how to explain that to Damien if he didn't already think so. Dick checked to see if Danny was home yet, pulling the car through the cave instead of the garage when he wasn't. Inside, Tim was busy with a case on the main computer. Dick hadn't taken too much of an interest in it, knowing Tim's obsession with cold cases, but he had caught some searches about ghosts and ecto-entities. Secretive as always about his cases, he closed the tabs as soon as the car engine made their presence known. "You didn't go with Daniel?" Damien interrogated as soon as he exited the car. "He said he would be fine, and I had a case to work on," Tim said, chewing on some caffeinated gum. They hadn't left yet. Hearing what he needed, Damien headed to the elevator. "Nothing out of the ordinary?" Dick asked. "For now," Tim nodded, eyes on his phone. He looked up at Dick. "I was thinking of heading out soon for a case." Dick looked up curiously. "To where?" "The Caribbean," Tim offered. "A few of my leads pointed there." He shrugged nonchalantly. "Are you going alone?" Dick asked. It wasn't odd for them to go international for a case, but usually they required a few more hands on deck. Maybe this was a young justice case. "Me and Robin." Dick's whole body swiveled to look at his younger brother. "You," he pointed at Tim, "and Damien?" Tim blinked at him, as if he didn't understand the problem. "Yes?" "And you're confident neither of you is coming back in a body bag?" "Considering it's a joint interest, yes." "What's the case?" "We're holding off on sharing until we're certain of everything." Classic Tim. Sure. But voluntarily working with Damien? That was new. It's not that Dick wasn't happy they were seemingly getting along. Don't start some international conflict while you're there. And we should be good. "Okay, I'll file it after I figure out the dates. Let me know beforehand. I'll talk to B." "You're the best," Tim said energetically, heading to another corner of the cave. "I know," Dick scoffed, receiving an inattentive middle finger. 8:46 p.m. Danny knew he wasn't alone. Alfred was somewhere doing his impossible list of tasks, and Bruce had said he would be in his study, a term Danny knew to associate with their basement headquarters, where everyone else probably also was. In a way, it almost seemed nostalgic. It was how it was in the house he'd grown up in. Danny was in an empty house, while his parents were busy with their newest project in the basement. Just instead of obsessing over ghosts, it was murderers and thieves and gangs and mafia groups and whatever else happened in Gotham. Not able to stand the way the walls towered over him in his room, Danny made his escape. He walked the familiar path to the garden, but the hallways seemed too long now, too narrow and too wide. The weather outside was warm, despite the time of year. Danny had hoped that Thomas would have been able to cheer him up, but for the first time, the stone that had always reminded him that he was allowed here wasn't a comfort. Danny sat by the boy's resting spot, feeling ridiculous for the emotions piling in his chest. This time yesterday, they had all sat around and laughed and joked about Danny's childhood antics. Not even a week ago, they'd all carved the time in their schedule to come to Danny's game. They cared about Danny. They proved it since Danny had come to live in the horrible excuse of a house. And Danny cared too. So he waited patiently and understandingly for them to explain what they really did when they disappeared at night. He would wait until they trusted him to tell the rest of their story, the rest of their lives. He wouldn't push. Danny knew how daunting it was to trust someone. He knew about all the things that could go wrong. He'd learned it when Wes had followed him around for months to catch Danny in the act of transforming into Phantom. Danny had taken the chance to trust him, and maybe it hadn't gone well at first, but he'd come around. He'd learned when he had no choice to tell Red Huntress, who had been bent on his destruction. He hadn't expected that to go well, but it had. And he especially learned when he'd met the only other ghost that was still alive like him, and he expected that to go great, but it hadn't. Danny waited patiently. It wasn't like there was a set of rules for when it was appropriate to tell your long-lost son about your vigilante persona, but Jason had already told him. Well, Phantom had told Jason that Danny already knew, but Phantom wasn't hiding it from the Bats either. They'd all made out that there was a connection between Phantom and Danny, just not what kind of connection. But Jason had trusted Danny enough to confront him, not only about his secret identity, but also about Phantom's. Danny knew trust came slowly, especially when the risks were so high. Trust was scarce and a dangerous thing to hand out, and it had been all right that they cared about Danny but didn't trust him. Really, he didn't mind. Had the bushes grown since the last time Danny came here? The more Danny tried to move away from the leaves' unwelcomed caresses, the closer the other bushes seemed to become, like they were growing around them. He could hear the echo of Jack's and Maddie's footsteps coming up the stairs to Danny's room to demand that he bring Phantoms to them. The fearful cries of the ghosts they almost captured echoed around him. He tried to sneak away from them. He couldn't let them find him. Danny's stomach twisted nauseatingly. He hated going to the doctor. He followed the pebbled path to his escape. Danny couldn't remember what it was he had to escape from, but he'd arrived at the gates of the manor. The metal arches of hypnotizing leaf-like decorations twisted into an artistically cohesive W. No one would question their arrival at Wayne Manor, with the infamous gate to the property looming 9 feet above the ground. Wayne Manor for the Waynes that lived inside. The Waynes were the aristocrats known for their near single-handedly funding any prosperity Gotham could be credited for. The Waynes that were also the Bats, Spurs, and Associates. Those accredited for any propriety of Gotham's adjusting crime rates and resident bearers of justice. Did that mean Danny was a fake? That the stone lied and he wasn't supposed to be here, like it wanted Danny to think? Beloved son. Maybe Danny wasn't someone who should be trusted. Danny didn't even tell himself some of the secrets he was keeping. After all, he hadn't even been able to trust himself with keeping her safe. How could he possibly redeem himself after that? The iron gates loomed over him menacingly, daring him to act against them. He could phase through, and then he would be free. Danny wouldn't have to stay trapped in a place he didn't belong. He knew there were layers to their security system, but it was designed to keep people out, not ghosts in. He just needed to get closer, and he could get through. His feet felt like lead as the fence grew taller. Danny pushed his left foot forward, closing the distance between him and freedom. Then his right foot, then... Danny? Danny's head moved against the wind to look at the voice. The path to the gate forked into the path he had emerged from, and the one Tim stared at him from. His eyes were large and smudged with black. His hair was tousled in the night wind, and his hoodie was thrown on like he'd been in a rush. The boots that peeked out from his fitted red pants weren't a brand Danny had ever seen. Danny's lips tilted upward, and the words came out before he'd really even registered the situation. "Is it your turn to watch me tonight?" Danny was pretty sure that was a joke. Tim's breathing was uneven, like he'd rushed to get here, his phone gripped in his hand. "Where are you going?" Danny realized he didn't really know the answer to that question, so instead he said, "It's kind of scary in here." Danny had no idea how much land was actually inside the fence, but the longer he stayed here, the more it felt like he was drowning in air. The hospital had walls, too, and so-called open spaces, but he was allowed to walk around as he liked. That's what they had said, but Danny hadn't been allowed to go further than where he could be watched. He had to stay inside the fence. It wasn't safe, they'd said. They're professionals, Danny. They can help you. Did he need help? Was there something wrong with him? You're sneaking out. I am? He wasn't sneaking. Tim saw him. And the cameras that were everywhere could see him. Was it Barbara on the other end, or Oracle? Did it matter? Was there a difference? Tim seemed nervous. I'll come with you. Tim made his way to where the paths converged, putting his phone in his pocket. Of course. Danny was only ever free when the warden was with him. Why? Don't you trust me? It's not safe for you to be on your own, Danny, Tim tried to explain. Danny knew Tim curled into himself under the looming presence of the gate that held the fence together. How could he call Danny helpless when he braced himself under the weight of the metal rosaries? You're hurt. Was he? Right, his arm was broken. And we're miles away from the city. It'll take emergency responders at least 5 minutes to get here. A lot can happen in 5 minutes. A lot can happen in 5 minutes. Tim knew the terror of the fences. He could escape with Danny, but Tim wasn't like him. He couldn't disappear into the night like the ghost they'd made him into. Tim had survived, and he was alive in a way that Danny would never get to be. He needed to show Tim how to get over the gate. Danny knew that it would mean that his escape was being broadcasted, but he and Tim would need to get far enough away before they could take them back inside the fence. They needed to get out, not be let out. And if he were let out, they would know. They would be after him. Danny needed to escape. Tim hadn't seemed too fond of the idea of Danny climbing the gate, but when his feet were planted firmly on the open end, Danny turned to look at the boy still stuck in the entrapment. Wait there, Tim told him as he followed the path Danny had laid for his escape. Where are we going to? He asked once he caught up with Danny. Danny hadn't thought about a destination, but now that they were free, they could go wherever they liked. Even though Danny didn't answer, Tim kept pace right next to him. Danny headed off in a direction, hoping it was the right one. There were no cars on the dark, never-ending road Danny and Tim walked along. One side of the road was blocked off by the continuation of the entrapment of Wayne Manor, and the brick wall was clean and polished, no matter the distance they walked away from it. The other side had trees trimmed into perfect mushrooms and balloons. The road was never-ending, and both sides of it created only one direction to move in. The foggy light of the moon and the fence's lights were all the two escapees had to see their way. Danny wasn't sure how long they'd been walking before the perfect wall of the fence bled into a vine-infested stone that cracked in the corners. While the balloons and mushrooms continued on the other end, the road got darker without the lights that had been offered from the perfect Wayne wall. Their travels brought them to the gate that held the stone wall together. This one wasn't blooming and folding into itself like the one that held them before. There was a plate of metal that had been carved out instead of into. There were two dragons cast to forever chase each other, their maws on the other's tail. This was my parents' house, Tim whispered, watching the dragons chase each other with Danny. I haven't been here since I was 13. There was a distant forlornness in the way he said it. After all, Tim had been brought to the perfect Wayne house when his could no longer hold him inside its walls. Danny looked at the boy who'd been banished from his own crest. Do you want to go inside? He couldn't face the monsters that had once been under his bed, but perhaps he was right to think Tim was braver than him. There was a stiffness in the silence that surrounded the runaways, as the crestfallen one placed a gloved hand on the beast of his past, and the dragons parted to let him inside. They screeched in contempt at the boy who'd returned to them and forced his way through their rust. It's open, Tim stated, surprised. Had no one bothered to cage the dragon in the gates after the last of the keepers had left them? Perhaps they saw no reason when there was no one to keep inside. Tim led Danny around the weather-torn garden of his past, pointing out the holders of his childhood memories. The grass was overgrown, and the trees billowed wildly over their heads. The pathways that were once there were shrouded in moss and weeds indistinguishably. The front doors of the tall, standing Drake Manor did not hinder their exploration. The spirits of the house blundered around Danny and Tim, claiming the prince had brought back the air. The walls and floors were sheathed in the protective layer of dust, and cobwebs decorated the generational paintings and pottery. The ballrooms didn't sparkle like they did in Tim's memories, and all the doors cried in pain as they forced their way through. The rediscovery of Drake Manor was brought to an abrupt halt when the heavy boots clanged on the marble floors. Tim's head snapped around at the sound, brought out of his childhood to see how it had done with the curse of time. "Batman," he greeted the shadows. "What are you two doing here?" The gruff voice came through the darkness. His tone and shoulders exposed his false sense of understanding. Somehow, he'd known where to find them, and it made him deluded to think that he knew them. He thought they were convicts that had escaped, not runaways to freedom. The way Tim stood straighter, ready to offer an explanation, only irked Danny further, knowing the wrong words would earn him satisfaction. "It's his house." Danny snapped at the black-edged blob in the shadows. "Are you going to kick us out?" "It's not safe here. You can return in the morning." "Danny, we should head back," Tim whispered to him. Why did everyone except Danny seem to know how to keep him safe? "We're not leaving." Danny didn't really have a particular interest in the bug-infested nepotism trap, but he wouldn't let the blob of shadows be the one to give him orders. "Danny, you need to breathe." There was a hand coming for him. "Don't tell me what to do!" Danny heard himself say in an unsheathed rage. They were coming for him. Why was he so angry? The hand receded back into the blob quickly. Someone else tried to put a hand on his shoulder. Danny flinched away at the unexpected contact. Who was standing behind him? Danny tried to look at the person next to him, but his face was a blur. Where did Tim go? The blur said something to him. Danny needed to find Tim. He couldn't have gone far. The blur and the blob followed Danny down the hallways. They were saying something, but he couldn't hear anything over the echoing void that threatened to deafen him. They took Tim. He needed to lose them so he could find Tim before they hurt him. If he phased through the walls, they wouldn't be able to follow him. When the hallway curved, Danny kept straight, ready to disappear through the wall. But the sensation of material washing over him like walking through an unparted curtain was replaced by the hard wall. The painting that had stopped him danced at the sight of Danny falling on his butt. It should have worked. Danny should have been able to disappear through the wall. He'd done it hundreds of times before. Did Danny not have his powers? Did they take Phantom too? How could he have not noticed? Was Danny going to die? How could he live without Phantom? The blob had said something again. He was counting. Was there a timer? Danny couldn't hear it over the piercing nothingness. Danny needed Phantom, or he couldn't stay alive, and Phantom couldn't stay dead. His arm hurt, his head hurt, his body hurt. Danny was hurt. The blur came closer this time. It put its hands on Danny's shoulder. Danny didn't bother fighting him off. It made Danny stand up and walk. "Where are you taking me?" "How about we go outside first?" the blur offered. His tone was gentle and placating. He realized he was shivering. "It's cold," Danny found himself saying. "It is," the blob agreed. The hands on his shoulder sent painful spikes of cold heat through his body, but Danny didn't move them away. Only the living felt pain like that. Danny hadn't realized they were outside until they stopped walking. He could see the gate from where he stood by the broken fountain. It was open. It wasn't as cold outside. Danny looked up at the smogging sky. There aren't any stars here. How disappointing. Do you want to see the stars? The blob asked. They're too far. Danny watched the gate swing in the wind, and his lungs constricted painfully when it almost closed. But the dragons were too wild for the wind to command. There was the sound of an engine coming closer, and the blob and Blur stood more alert at it. The biker cut off right in front of the gate. What's going on? The biker asked, running toward where Danny stood. Danny watched the clouds move in the wind. I don't know, the Blur said. He sounded worried. He's having a breakdown, the blob said, like he knew what Danny was thinking and feeling. Did something happen? The bite guy came closer. He was looking at Danny. I'm fine, Danny hissed. Why were they talking about him like he was some kind of specimen, like they were running tests on him? There was a strong gust of wind, and the gates clung shut. Danny was trapped. He was stuck. He hadn't been able to get Tim out. Had he really expected himself to do any better when he'd failed so drastically the first time he tried to save someone? Ellie was gone because of him. So was Tim, and now so was Phantom. Danny could feel something clawing at his chest. It slashed at Danny as it ripped its way through. Was that Phantom? Danny hadn't protected him. He didn't deserve to fight back against the thing in his chest. Holy crap, the biker guy shouted, alarmed. Danny, you need to relax, the Blur tried to tell him. Danny hadn't left in time. He was trapped. Hey, in and out, the biker guy tried. His hand was on Danny's arm. Don't grab him. The Blur pulled the hand off Danny. The blob had disappeared to where the dragons watched the cage, pulling apart their defenses and freeing Danny from his entrapment. The once welcoming wind struck at Danny like knives. The draping trees circled around him, matching the clouds' dance in the sky. Whoa, he heard, I gotcha. This concludes part 3 of chapter 23 of Regular Boy Daniel Wayne. I hope you've all enjoyed. This is really interesting. I'm wondering about what's happening here. It seems kind of sudden. I'm wondering if there's something going on with him at his ghost biology, because he kind of talked about the how the human doctors wouldn't be able to see what's really wrong with him. So I'm wondering if it's that's somehow related to what's happening right now. I don't know. It's really interesting. But I hope you all enjoyed, and thank you so much for listening.